Hi, so I just wanted to come on here and say hello, show my face so you can see what these hands for most of the video, who they belong to. So my name's Nicola Perren and I'm doing the wrap and weave workshop for you today, and I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the PowerPoint part of this wrap and weave workshop that was done as for part of the tea and chat series with the Textile Skills Centre. My name's Nicola Perren, and if you are interested in seeing what other kind of things I get up to, you can find me on Instagram at Perren Studios, and I've also got a Facebook page which is also Perren Studios. So feel free to follow and see what I get up to. So, what am I going to talk about? This video should be kept relatively short and sweet. While I say that, we're talking about nearly an hour. So I will keep this presentation really quick so we can get straight on to the practical stuff. This session was originally done as a live session, and this is a recording that's been done just after that, so I can pick up on some of the questions that came up. So, I'm going to talk about who I am. I'm going to provide some exemplars, talk through materials, and we're going to then do some making. So my name's Nicola Perren. I'm a freelance designer maker, tutor, and I teach a range of things including weaving, drawing, stitch and print. For me, wrap and weave is about using ideas of constructed cloth. Now this can be done very loosely with just a kind of like a slight acknowledgement of weaving, or it actually can be done in a very prescribed way, and one of the techniques I'm going to show you is very much working on woven structures, and then the second one we're going to play around with is very much a drawing based loose version of creating yarn wraps. Okay, so I think it's a really playful extension of drawing with yarn, and it can be a precursor to going on to doing some weaving, any other textile making processes, or even for outside of textiles as well. So as ideas of thinking about almost composition perhaps in photography, ideas for products in terms of material exploration. So it can kind of play around with a number of things. Okay. What I really like about this process is it's super accessible in terms of both skill and cost. So I've kind of categorized these wraps that we're going to be making into 4 categories. Okay, so the first one is the basic one and is probably more commonly known as a yarn wrap. And essentially it's just a simple way of wrapping your yarns around a piece of card, usually in quite a neat and orderly manner, and it's used in quite a functional way which is suggestive of the proportions of colour. Okay, now it is going very noisy outside the studio at the moment. I apologise. There is a kids' party a few doors down, and they're marching along the corridor as I try to talk. So apologise if you can hear that. Sorry, I was just saying that the colours within these yarn wraps, I think, become really much more kind of like potent and powerful as a tool when you start to question the proportions of how colour sits together. Often I see really beautiful yarn wraps, but nearly always the colours are kind of like put in a very equal proportion to each other, but in reality often within woven or any other kind of textile or design, the colour isn't usually all equally divided up. So I think it's nice to be able to play around and show different proportions and balances of colour. I've also shown in this PowerPoint the yarn wraps or cards just as the cards themselves, but also in with sketchbooks, on suggested mood boards and ideas boards and design boards. They're very much a kind of like a practical thing, but can also be a product in their own right. So the complex approach, okay, I think is about wrapping and building on your with your yarns. Okay, so for this we can see here in this mood board, we can see that these yarn wraps, the complex ones, again, they're pretty neat, okay, but they can also have more of a decorative purpose, and I think they can be really nicely suggestive of woven pattern, okay. And what I will do is in the workshop element of this presentation, I will show you some of these that have been done, and I'll show you the backs, which will give you a really kind of big clue as to how these have been produced, if it's not entirely obvious to you already. But essentially you'll be wrapping around one way, and then you wrap around the other direction, and then keep going backwards and forwards until you get your full wrap there. So the third type, which is the second workshop we're going to do, is about drawing, okay, and this is material play, and this is where I kind of really enjoy starting to use these, where we can start to really kind of like question a range of different mediums and see how things work together. We can bring in all kinds of materials in at this point. So on these ones I've drawn onto the ground with inks first. I'm also changing up some of the shapes that I'm working on. I could be working off of card, I could be working on stones, I could be working on items you find in the kitchen, or tools from the shed, or twigs and branches. You can work on whatever you want. Anything you can wrap around, essentially. And quite often with cards like this, or with its twigs or stones, you're not usually seeing the back side of them, because they're usually put onto boards, so you don't really have to worry about how things look on the back. So they're usually covered in tape and knots on the back. Okay, so the front of these ones, we've got crayons, we've got knotting starting to come in, excuse me, I'm flicking around there. We've got bits of felt, we've got stickers coming in, as well as tapes on the pages. I mean, who doesn't love some googly eyes, of course. So we've got a drawing here, as well as starting to kind of like almost explore our drawing with different materials, how that might work, playing around with some samples that come together. But I do like the idea that we can bring in things like crochet. You might have some little printed samples you want to put on there. There's a whole range of different things that you can do with this. But essentially it's kind of quite a collage based approach. So as we go on to the fourth type, which is the weave type. So this is what we're going to do for the first part of our workshop. And this is what I would call a structural wrap. And we are actually going to be weaving some woven structures for this. So as we move across this board here, it might seem quite subtle to you, but there are actually 5 different structures happening on here. We start off with plain weave over here. We've got a 1 and 3 twill section here. Then we go into a 2 and 2 twill, a 3 and 1 twill here, and then we finish off with a 4 and 4 twill. Okay, so for the workshop element, we're going to start off with this 4 and 4 twill that you can see over here on the right. And then I will show you quickly how you could go on to do the plain weave, and then I've also providing you with handouts for the other structures if you want to do those. Okay, so this is exactly the same structure, and this is where weaving I think can become pretty exciting. So this is the 4 and 4 twill here. Okay, this is using yarns that are the same diameter, the same weight, in the both colours and in the warp and the weft. Whereas when we come on to this one here, it's still the same structure, but we're using 2 different weights of yarns and colours in the warp and weft, and so you can start to see how we can get quite different effects just by playing around with either the colour changes, with the yarn weights, and then also further to this workshop, which I don't necessarily cover, but by changing up the number of threads you have in each colour block, you can also get completely different patterns. And for those who are further interested in exploring this, it's a technique called colour and weave that you find in woven structures. Okay. And sorry, actually, just before I go on to the next slide, what I also want to point out is why I think that working with yarn wraps and playing with weave on card, while it's not the same as weaving on looms, assuming people have access to looms. If you don't, then it's a brilliant way to do things. But excuse me, okay. What it also does is it allows us to play around and kind of question the different weights that we do within our drawing. So for example, on this sketchbook page here, we've got quite brush-like marks here, quite soft marks, and that's reflected in the quality, I would say, of this green yarn here, okay. But we've also got different kind of weights of line work going on in here, from relatively fine to relatively wide here, okay. And again, we can see that reflected in the yarns that we're choosing to use, okay. So who are some key people to look at? There are, of course, many others, and these are some of my go-to people. So Judith Scott with this wrapped piece over here on the far right. Excusez-moi. This is an artist who I think just does the most amazing work with wrapping yarns and materials, and sometimes they're a size that can go in your hand, and other times they're wrapped. The wrapping is this intense use of yarns around, say, a chair or a table, all kinds of things, okay. And then over here, this image in the middle of the screen is by Dianca Decker, and their work I think is really interesting. It kind of moves beyond what we're doing in this workshop, but essentially is playing around with woven structures with strips of paper, and they make really beautiful sculptural forms off card there, okay. So materials, I'm just going to kind of pause on this for a second in case you want to screenshot this. I'm actually going to talk through these things in the workshop element, so I won't go through all of those here, but it's here for your reference if you want to use it. In terms of structures, so these are the structures that we're going to be using today. As I said earlier on, we're going to be working to start off with the 4 and 4 twill, okay, and then if you want to, you can play around with plain weave, and I will bring up on screen the other document, a PDF document that I will share with you as well, that has some other structures on. And in the workshop element, I will talk through how you read these, okay. So while this is just a brief workshop, this is a free open access workshop, I'm actually going to be starting to run a new series of online sessions with the Textile Skills Centre. It's open to all, so it's open to teachers, to students, but also to the public. And this will be a 5-part series which is all about drawing for textiles. And we will be drawing working with more traditional medium, but with quite an abstract, playful approach to it, as well as actually drawing with textiles themselves. So come and check that out, and maybe I'll see you there. So again, my Instagram account is @Perren Studios. Let's do this. What's it called? The handout that I have provided for this workshop. You should be able to download this as a PDF. It has 5 different structures on it. The first one is the 4 and 4 twill, which is the main one we use in the workshop. We then touch on the plain weave, and then I've given you 3 other weave structures that work in exactly the same way, but give you different patterns that you might want to play with as well if you take this further, okay? And in the video, I talk through and explain how to understand what all these different marks on the page indicate, Okay, and also I have just noticed a spelling check error. Instead of saying bottom left here, it says bottom. So I do apologise for that. That's where we're at. Okay, good luck with that. Okay, so for the demo part of this workshop, I just wanted to start off by showing you some of the items, the key items that you will need. So you'll need some kind of card. Okay, so often I find I've got scrap bits, old bits of mount board, so I'm just using some old bits of that. You need, for the demo I'm doing, I'll be working with two different coloured yarns. So I've got a cream or an ecru and a black there, okay, but you can have any colour. They can be different weights or thicknesses. And I'm going to show you some of the yarns in just a minute that you might want to play around with. I've also just got some washi tape. So I use the washi tape quite a lot. A couple of big needles, so darning needles. If they're the ones that are slightly blunt on the end, that's a bit easier, but I've got a little trick that I use if they are quite sharp, that I'll show you in a little minute. Pair of scissors, and essentially that's all you need. You can do it with a whole load of other things, but if you just want to do something in a very accessible and cheaper way, then this is absolutely great. Okay, so let's just get these out of shot so that I can focus on what I'm going to do. Need those. Okay, so put those there for a second. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we are going to make a yarn wrap. Okay, so I've got a couple here. So except for it's a yarn wrap with the weave structures. So it's a woven piece. So this was the piece that you would have seen in the PowerPoint, where we're using a thick yarn, which has quite a different texture to this finer yarn, which is more of a tape, a bit of a tape yarn, actually, in some places. So yeah, so it's just woven around the card, and actually, there you go, there's the back. So you can see there's lots of tape holding it down. Very much usually are a one-sided object. There are ways of doing it, so you can do it really neatly with plenty of knots and things like that, but we're just doing these as quite quick pieces. But you can also kind of like change the shapes of the boards, add things onto the boards, even though we're doing, excuse me, the weaving. So on here we've got some part of it is the 4-and-4 twill that we're going to work on here, and then we've also gone in and done a bit of plain weave. So the handout that I have supplied includes, let me just get these two sheets here, okay, includes 5 weave structures that you can use for this workshop. Okay, you can use more, you can go onto the internet and find them, but essentially we're going to be working with this 4-and-4 twill structure, and then we'll just very quickly cover plain weave. But if you're really enjoying this or you want to expand it further, I've provided you with 3 other structures. Now I am going to talk through a little bit how we actually work with these structures, okay, how we read them, but I'll do that once we get to the weaving point. Okay, so what are we going to start off with doing? So we're going to start off by wrapping our yarns around our piece of board. Okay, so I have started off, I've done this onto some pink board so that you can see the yarns quite clearly, and you can also see that there's a spacing in between each of these yarns. This is going to allow, when we put the other yarn in, time to breathe. If this was all squashed up, your weft yarn would be so far apart because you wouldn't be able to beat it down properly. You wouldn't get the structure. Okay, so that gap is worth kind of like playing around a little bit with for when you start to make your own, and you can experiment away with that. So yeah, let's get on with it. So I've got my 2 colours. If you only have one colour available to you, you can do that, but with the colour and weave effects, which is the thing that we're playing around with, it will look different depending on how many of each end or each kind of striping you have. So if I'd done this 2 black, 2 white, 2 black, 2 white, while it's exactly the same weave structure, it will actually visually look very different to doing it with blocks of 4. And the same if you did it as blocks of 8 or you changed it as you went across. But that's one of the really nice things to play around with this. You don't actually need a lot of structures. You can play around with different weights and different ordering of colours in order to get different patterns. So let's just set that aside there, bring my yarns back in. Okay. And I'm going to start just by wrapping what we're going to refer to as the warp yarn. So the warp yarn is the yarn that we're going to wrap onto the card and it will stay on the card, okay? The weft yarn is then the one that we're going to weave into it. So that's, in that sense, it's quite similar to weaving on the looms, okay? So the warp is the yarn that is set in the loom, and the weft is the yarn that you introduce to actually weave and connect all those warp yarns together, okay? So we're going to put some black thread on first. I've got a needle pre-threaded here. I'm just going to tie a knot on the end of the yarn, okay? You don't have to do this. I just find I kind of pull my yarns fairly taut, and so just having the knot there holds it in place. So I'm going to come over onto the back. I would like my black yarn to start over on this side, so I'm just going to tape this in place just here. So I have set this up to have 16 warp ends wrapped onto the card, okay? You can do it with less, you can do it with more, but with the way I've set up the weave structure for you, then 16 is a good place to start. So we're going to start off just by taking this black thread, this black yarn, and wrapping it around the card. Okay, so I'm being quite precise. With the second workshop element, which is the more drawing based, actually, let's take that off. I'm going to use wrap straight from here. Change of plan, people. Just because that's got the needle on it, and I'll use that for doing my weaving in a minute. So let's just attach this back onto the back there. Sorry, as I was saying, what was I saying? When I rewatch this video back, I'll be like, yes, of course, Nicola, that's what you were saying. Okay, I'm just going to hold that in place with some tape just there. And then I'm going to go on to my ecru yarn. I'm going to just keep that attached. This isn't going to be so wide. If this was a really, really big piece of card, then I might detach it. But for now, because we're just doing this as quite a small project and also quite quickly for the video. Okay, so I'm going to just keep the black yarn hooked out of the way there, and then I can introduce this ecru yarn. So if you aren't a weaver or aren't aware, I keep saying the word ecru. What that means is it's a yarn that's hasn't been dyed, or often hasn't been bleached, but sometimes it has. But basically it's in its natural state. So rather than it being a white yarn, it's actually its natural state, pre-dyed. So, and can't get out of the habit of calling it ecru rather than white or cream. Okay, so let's round off a bit more of that. Okay, now I think I've got those a little bit uneven, so I'm just going to just move these all up. That's what I was saying. we can be very neat about this, and this is a useful one to be quite neat and methodical with. But in the second workshop I'm going to do, which is around drawing and playing with these wraps, then you don't have to be quite so neat. You don't have to be neat at all. Okay. What I like about this is it kind of like allows for different kinds of approaches to creativity. Just cut that off. I could, if I had a bit more time and patience, and normally I would actually tie that off as well so it doesn't ping out, but just to keep this show on the road, I'm now going to just wrap this ecru yarn around here. There we go. Okay. And let me just cut this. Yeah, there we go. So we now have our board all ready to start weaving on. So I'm going to put that to the side and I'm going to work on this one here. Okay, so let's go back to my black thread, okay, that actually had the needle already on. Okay, so the weave structures, how are we going to read this? Okay, so let's just put this just over here for now. Let me bring my pen in. Okay, so there is a top and there is a bottom to this. So I am reading this with the green and grey squares at the bottom and to the sides. At the top, it is actually blank. Let me just take a sip of my coffee. Okay, so how do we read this? Okay, so these green and these grey squares that are around the edge are actually, they're nothing to do with what I'm actually going to weave, but they're there to as an indication of the order in which I have the colours. So if I turn this upside down, so we've got our dark colour and our lighter colour here. So we've got 4 of our dark, 4 light, and vice versa. So we can just see where we've got up to in the pattern when we start to weave it in. And then in the weft, so the yarns that we're going to be putting in, we're also going to be doing these in blocks of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4 black threads are going to go through there, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 ecru or cream threads are going to go through there. Okay, now something else to consider. So this is where some things start to kind of differ from being weaving on a loom. So you may be a weaver and therefore you'll know this, but if you're not a weaver or it's been a long time since you've worked on the loom, on a loom we would actually weave, we wouldn't weave all the way around the card. We would just go backwards and forwards within the actual warp yarns, okay? And you can even do that on the card as well. You don't have to go all the way round. For this demonstration, I'm going to go round the card, okay? But you don't have to. So you would read the weave structure in England. And I say that England because in other countries, including Scotland, people will read things in different orders, okay? So that's one of the funny things, exciting, interesting things about weaving is everybody reads the structures in a slightly different way. So in England, we read from the bottom upwards and we read from the bottom left, okay? However, because we are going to be going around the card, this is where we're going to start to do things differently. Okay, so if you are right-handed, okay, then personally I find it easier to wrap around from the left and then bring my needle in from the right hand side. So I'm going to come in on this side and read that, okay? Then I'm going to wrap around the card and I'm going to come in from the right hand side again and do my threading sequence for my second thread from the right to the left. If you are left-handed, however, I would read it the other way. So I would be threading my needle in from the left to the right. I would wrap around my card at the back and then come back in again for the second one and read that way. Okay, so I will be doing this from the right hand side, okay, but I think it makes sense how you would do it from the left, but I will for the first few picks explain the sequence from the right and from the left. Okay, so I'm just going to put this up here. Okay, so we've got it there as our reference point, okay, for reading. Okay, when we read this, where we have a square that is filled in with colour, okay, or if you go and want to do some further research on this and you look on the internet, or you go and get a Weave Structures book out, they might use crosses, they might use dashes, they might use dots. Basically, wherever there is a mark or it's coloured in as a square, what they're saying is the warp is up on the face of the fabric, up on the front. So you would be threading where there is a mark underneath the warp yarn. So that stays up on the top. Where there's no mark or no colour, in this case, we're going to be on top of those warp yarns. Okay, so as we start to weave this, that will make more sense. So as I said, I'm going to start weaving from the bottom right down here. Okay, if you're going to be weaving from left to right, start at tape your yarn onto the back here, but I'm going to tape my yarn on just behind here. Okay, so to make sure it's just behind there, I'm just going to keep my hand there so I remember which side it is. Okay, just going to put my knot just say there and tape that on. Okay, so I could just go through with my needle straightforward, but because this actually is a needle with a sharp end, what I'll find is at points, can you see there, just did it straight away, it will catch on those yarns, which is really frustrating. This is quite a slow process in the first place. You don't want to slow it down even more by doing that. So personally, I actually take the other end of my needle, okay, which is the end that's got the thread through it, which is almost always blunt, okay, and I'm going to just thread through that way. So what is this weave structure telling me to do? So we've got 1, 2, 3 orange, so that's asking me to go under the first 3 warp yarns, okay? So I'm going to go under the first 3 warp yarns, and then I'm going to come up with my needle up onto the surface for 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, go over the top of those and then back under, and it goes under 4, over 4, and then back under 1 at the end, okay? So that's how I read it if I am going from the right to the left. If I'm, however, going from left to right, I would have read that as going under 1, over 4, under 4, over 4, and then finishing with under 3, okay? So essentially you're just reading it in exactly the same way, but just from a different side. So what do you do once you get to the end? You can leave it quite loose if you want to, because I like to kind of like see the structure quite clearly. I'm pulling it relatively tautly, but that's something you can experiment with. It's not any kind of set rules, okay? On a loom, it would do to particular kind of like tension, particularly when you move on to power looms, but we're not on power looms, we're on pieces of card and we can do it how we fancy, okay? You can even try out doing them at quite different tensions and see how they finish. Okay, so we've done the first thread. We're now coming up onto the second one. So I've come round my card, back up onto the front of it, and I now need to go under 2. So go under 2, over 4, under 4, over 4, there we go. I've got quite a long needle. It'd be nice if it was about an extra centimetre long and I could just get it quite across quite quickly. So what I'm doing now, I can see now that that yarn has become a little bit looser, so I'm just going to pull it under a bit more tension, so then I can pull that one round, and then it just holds itself in the right position. What I'm going to do is I can either use the blunt end of my needle just to push that down into it a bit more, okay, or I can just leave it as it is. Just pull that down. So I'm now coming round to my third pick. So as I said, the warp is the term for the yarn that's all the yarns that are always on there, okay? So a full set of yarns is called the warp. An individual yarn, just for some weaving knowledge, is called an end. So each one of these is an end. So we've got 16 ends to make up our warp. And then in our wefts, this is the yarn we're threading in, that is actually an individual one. It's called a pick. So I may have already used the term, just in case you're wondering what I'm talking about. A pick is one of the weft threads. So I just push that through there. So just keep on doing this. So I'm just using my finger just to push that down into place, and then I'm going to come round and do it again. So the fourth one, I'm going to start with over 4. This is the easiest because we've got in blocks of 4. Okay, so just going to go under the white threads and over the black threads. Okay. While I'm doing this, I don't know if you've noticed, I'm actually using my other hand, my left hand in this case, just holding those in place. Just kind of makes it a bit easier. Okay, so I'm just going to put some tape over those because I'm about to switch to the ecru yarn. I'm going to actually cut this off. If it was long enough to do another 4 wraps, I would keep it hanging there, just like we did when we did the warp. But because actually it's not long enough anyway, I will just put that there and bring in my ecru yarn. And I'll just have to thread up some more yarn to do the next block. Okay, it's just tying a knot. I'm coming in from the right, so I'll just attach that there. So if you are left-handed, hopefully that is making sense how you're reading it, because I am saying it out loud. For right-handed people, I apologise. I think it will make sense. When I asked, so this version of the video is actually a recorded after the live event, and when I asked at the live event if everybody was keeping up with me, and I was going faster, everybody seemed to be all right, so let's just assume we're still in that situation. So I'm now coming in with the first of my second colour, so I can quickly see where I've got up to, because I had put indicated on here my different colours. So I'm coming in here, even though that's on green, this is my ecru yarn. So that means I'm going to go over the first 3 because they're not coloured in, and then under the next 4. So I'm going to go over 3 and under 4. And I do have a blunt needle with my ecru, so I'm going to go through it the other way instead of backwards, even though I've still managed to catch that thread there. There we go. Okay. So let's wrap this around there. Holding it in place up there just to keep it under tension. You can see that the yarns start to move around. It's okay, we can just start to manipulate them. You might want to just keep them manipulated as you're going, or you might decide, oh, I'll just get them all on there and then I'll move them all around. I think that's good if you've got it all under an even tension all the way through. If you find that you've got some looser yarns, then I would change the tension immediately, but if it's just readjusting it, you could wait until the end. Okay, so we're on this one, so we're going to go over 2, under 4, over 4. Okay. You can create your own structures if you want to, okay? So all you need is some gridded paper, and then you can just draw those out. If you had done this card and you wanted to do it with, say, wider with more threads on, you might have been doing this with a really fine thread, so it might have been a sewing thread actually that you might use on a sewing machine, which can look really effective, but it's obviously very fine, so 16 ends wouldn't be very wide, it'd probably only be about that wide. So if you wanted to do multiples, you would just, it's the same structure. In fact, this is the same, I've done this over 16 ends, but actually it's the same block here is the same as this block here. Okay, so I've just repeated it. So you basically, that's actually the weave structure. I've just drawn it out twice so we can see the whole thing, but you can just read that as many times as you need to get all the way across the fabric. But essentially, apart from the first 3 or 4 ends, you're going under and over 4 each time. Okay, so we're now on this one, so I'm going to go over 1, under 4, over 4. I'm trying to keep this video to a certain time so I don't waffle on. Okay, so hopefully you're all keeping up with me, or you're just pausing the video just to see. And then the final one is going under 4, over 4, under 4, over 4. And then we're now ready to repeat that. So let's just show you. Tie this one off first. Okay, just holding that in place. Okay, again, it's not that long, so I'm just going to cut that off without cutting all my other threads. I nearly did there. Okay, so as I say, we can start to just manipulate this a bit if we want to, just to kind of keep it all in place. Just see how it's going. Okay, which is quite normal on a loom, although you wouldn't do it while it was on the loom. Usually you would do it through the washing process afterwards, the finishing processes, but we're not on looms, we're on cards. So if we were to now carry on, we'd just go start back at the bottom and just keep on reading it up. So on this board here, for example, I've read through this twice. So I've done this block twice across there, and then I'm going to read this twice up that way. Okay, I'm actually going to, in this demo, I'm going to now switch to just very quickly talking through the plain weave. Okay, on this structure here. Okay, so got exactly the same patterning in our warp and weft. Okay, I'm not actually going to tie this all on, I'm just going to show you. But if I was to have a longer thread on here, I would just tie this on as I did before. And then what I'm doing, okay, is just reading this. So again, it's a white square and a coloured in square. So in this case, it's blue. So where it's got no colour in it, that means I'm going to go over the top of the thread. Where it's a blue square, I'm going to go under. So essentially, we're going to go over, under, over, under. So I just thread it through, and that's going to give me a plain weave structure all the way across. Okay, and then on the next end or pick, sorry, you would go over first and then under. So you just change the order of the sequence. So you can see here we've got a different patterning happening in these sections. Okay, if I'd then gone on to do a white block here, this would have been white and black, and then this would have been, well, it all would have been, but it would look like we've got just white here, okay, and then black here, white and black. So we get some nice different kind of contrasts and patterns. Okay, so let's move on to our more playful drawing based wrap board. So this is actually the board I did in the live demo. Okay, where you can see I quite liked the idea of having some quite different yarns playing together. I've got different threads that we're going to be playing around with for this one. So let me bring my new material. So for this example, I'm going to work on a whiteboard. I've got some bits of fabric I'm interested in using. I've got this really lovely iridescent tape. I've got some metallic yarn there. Okay. I've got some ink here, so if I wanted to draw straight onto my board, I can do. In fact, I might do that now. While that's drying, I will then show you some other kinds of yarns that I quite like playing around with. So let's just see what happens. So this might be very wet. Okay, so this is some ink that I've just made up. Ooh, that's nice. Let's see how that dries, if it dries in the time for the video. Okay, so other yarns, while that's drying, Okay, I like to play around with. So our what I call fancy yarns. So this is a like a tape yarn that's been given a metal, kind of like a metallic finish. Let me lean across. Got some other yarns here. So this is a paper yarn, which is absolutely beautiful, isn't it? Look at that. So it's a space-dyed yarn, so it changes colour as the thread goes on. So that can create a really, really nice effect. And then we have, this yarn's got a little, like tiny little pom-poms, a boucle effect yarn, which is really lovely. So pom-poms, like to put pom-poms on yarn wraps as well as googly eyes. But you might not have any of these kind of fancy yarns. I work in a weave department and have access to yarns. These are actually all my yarns, but because I like to collect them myself for weaving with. But equally, although I don't hand knit, I do crochet, so I might have some kind of like hand knit yarns available. You can be using all kinds of things. You could be using scraps of fabric that you've cut up. We're going to use some bits of fabric, but as thicker, wider strips actually today, but there's no reason you can't be cutting that up. You might have an old t-shirt. There's loads of YouTube videos about how to convert a t-shirt into a ball of yarn, which you can then work with. It might be an old jumper that's gone past its best, so you can unravel it and reuse that yarn. There's a whole load of different things that you can use. But what I like about this more drawing based approach is I quite like, as you can see here, just to think about kind of like how materials play together, how we can make different marks, have different kind of surface qualities, as well as drawn physical marks on here. Let's see, it's getting drier. Might not be completely dry when we get started, but we can be playing around with our range of different kinds of tapes and materials. Elastic bands are quite nice to play with. You might be stapling onto them. You might be adding lace fabrics, different papers. It's really open to kind of interpretation, and it depends on what kind of drawing you've been doing. But it might be that you've got a drawing, and I don't have a drawing with me to work from for this. I'm just going to play and see what happens. But you could have a drawing. Let me get you a quick sketch. We can open a page as an example. Just quickly try to find a sketchbook now. So yes, so it might be that we decide actually we're going to interpret this, and I've got, as you can see here, I've got a block of two different colours, so I could also kind of colour up my board. And then we've got, it plays around with different thicknesses of line. So we've got this thickness of line. You can see here we've got this slightly finer thickness, and then we've got these big blocky weights of yarn. So again, playing around with different thicknesses can be a really nice thing to do. Okay, so let's put that back over here. Okay, so I am going to see how dry this is. I think what I want to do is I possibly want to attach, ooh, that could be quite nice. I'm going to attach that on there. You see I had some Pritt stick with me here. I could just tape it on. I'm just going to put some glue straight on here. Okay, so obviously this is, which other bit was going to need to be glued? That bit there. Not permanent. This is just some Pritt stick with fabric, but that's my point about it being accessible. You don't have to have access to loads of super expensive equipment. You can take your time and do these as beautiful, and that's the bit I didn't glue, as beautiful objects in their own right, but equally you can do this kind of quite quickly and take the pressure off. Sometimes drawing feels a real pressure to people. So you might have students, you might be a student, you might be somebody who's just playing around with this as an idea. It can become very precious over these things. Let's stick you on there as well. I think that's cool. I might even go a bit more over that. That's really nice. So where it changes, so it just changes the density of this colour from here to here. Ooh, I like that. But instead of gluing that, because it is a net, I'm going to just take this down quickly. Did you see how I've picked my special grid paper washi tape for this session? I thought, A, you can see it clearly, you can see what I'm doing, so there's no secrets, but also, who doesn't love a grid? As a weaver, I think that has to be said. I love a grid. Okay, so let's play with this yarn. So I'm going to add this yarn. I could go at an angle. I'm quite liking the idea of possibly just coming down here. I could tie a knot in that, but for quickness on here, I'm just going to thread this on. So I might decide to do some weaving into this board like we've just been doing, or I might just do some yarn wrapping. Actually, that's what I'm going to do. So which other yarn is going to look good with this colouring? Let's bring in some space dyed yarn, and actually let's cut off a length here. So this is actually going to be using a bit of the process that we use in the complex boards that I'm going to show you later. Just put that down there. Okay, so I'm going to tape this. So rather than just wrapping that all the way around and just going for it, actually what I'm going to do is attach, I will put a knot in this because I have a feeling that will just slip out. That's a big knot, but it's big enough. And I could be precise and think about where I'm putting this. At the moment, I'm just going to stick it down and see where it takes me. So I'm going to put this yarn across here. And then I'm going to take this yarn around here. Just going to hold that there. Going to bring that one there. Oh yes. Let's keep it flat. We could twist this a bit later on, which could be nice. I'm just going to go through there. We can kind of change the gaps, so we try to keep the gaps similar. Ooh, this is a pretty one. That was a good call, Perren, well done. So we could just keep it flat. We could put a twist in it to add another dimension. I think I was quite liking the flat. Or maybe I'd keep that one. I don't know if I've got enough for one more. No, let's keep that flat. I wonder what the number of people saying, no, you should have kept it twisted are. Just going to quickly bob that, take that down. I love this yarn. I can't remember where I got it from. It might have been Uppingham Yarns, which is a UK-based company. I'm sure it was from them. Uppingham Yarns, which is very nice. Now I've still got some of this. Let's go over one more. So that's just given us a really nice little subtle, and that has twisted, which is nice. That plays around really nicely with the different angles we've got going on here. Got these angles that came from that splat of yarn as well. So I'm just going to take that down there. Oh, it's looking pretty on the back. I quite like that actually. There's a nice little abstract drawing on the back. Let's get you off there. Okay, so there we go. Got some bits and pieces on my desk. That's quite a nice little simple one. Actually, normally mine's all singing, all dancing, but I quite like this one. And actually that comes in nicely to actually starting to think about these as little series. That actually looks really nice together as a board. Let's just clear this stuff away from there. That'd be really lovely. So you've got the graduation, so that's another space dyed, but that's actually an embroidery floss yarn. And again, on the back of the fork, you can just see some tape. There's no secrets. Okay, so we've got a space dyed embroidery floss going around our object there as a fork, and then we've actually got the space dyed there. So that's a really nice little connection, and that's silver and silver there. Good board, Nicola. Okay, so what else did I want to talk about quickly in the video? Let me check my list. Have I covered everything? So there were a few questions about types of yarns which are easier to work with and harder to work with. I would say a yarn that is quite elasticated. I'm just going to move across here to get something. If you've got a yarn that has quite a lot of give in it, so by kind of like pulling it, you can see, I suspect this one might have more. Not really, no. Oh, yes, okay, that's a good one too, as an example. So if you've got a yarn, we do pull under quite a bit of tension, okay? So this yarn here, if I'm pulling it, it does start to kind of like pull apart. You don't have to pull it that hard, but if you've got people who are just really wrapping their cards really tight, then that can be quite a challenge. Or if it's quite elasticated, it can ravel up a lot. So it might be overly twisted or under twisted, but also elastic does spring back on itself. So those are quite challenging yarns to use. If something doesn't have much give, like this one, and actually this amazing plastic based thread here, that's got a little bit of give in there, then they're quite nice to work with, okay? The finer the yarn, the more difficult it is to do, and the more slowly it takes to build up to see what effect is actually happening. So dependent on yourself or the people you're working with, you might want to check out some of the yarns first, but I just like the idea of just seeing and playing and seeing what comes of it. But I feel quite confident and comfortable working with different yarns and threads. So let's just put those up there. So these are the boards, and I kind of showed you what we did there in a way, where we can build up more complex yarn wraps. Okay, so you can see here we've got these colours, and you can see it kind of like building up in different areas here. Okay, so essentially what you do, and here's the back and all the mess, okay, is to say, like I would in this case, I've started in the middle here. So I've started with wrapping this blue coloured yarn here, this like duck egg blue. I've wrapped that around say 4 or 5 times. Don't know, I'm not going to count the yarns there, okay. And then I've also got the same thread and I've wrapped it that way the same number of times, and then I've gone to my next colour and wrapped that, and you just keep on wrapping around the card in different directions, in particular kind of groupings and numbers. Okay, so on this one, the blue and the ecru are in even numbers each time, but you can see here I've been changing, suddenly adding in this pink and this orange at different points in time, so we can build it up to create different kinds of patterning. Okay. One other question that came up was about making products using this idea. And at the time I wasn't so sure. I hadn't, to be honest with you, thought too much about that, because I tend to kind of focus on the making of textiles. And obviously we are mindful constantly as a textile designer what the end product is. But because these are more kind of like working boards and playful ideas, more like sketchbook pages, I think of. I hadn't really thought about that. So one of the things about them is they tend to be a one-sided thing. So this is the correct side and this is the back of them, which actually would make a really lovely drawing. So from that perspective, it's fine. But if this was a product such as, say, a bookmark, or was going to be used as something else, then don't really want to kind of like have that, and because it might be kind of quite delicate, and there's bits just all over the place, it might not work so well. So what you can do is you could mount this onto another piece of card on the back, and even you could make it a part of it, where, because if you were just to glue that, it probably just would get in a bit of a mess. So you could tape it, join it up together initially, and then I would be tempted just to put a couple of smart holes in there and thread the corners together just to hold it and make it a bit more stable. The other thing I think you can do is, for turning these into products, is if we think about these as drawings, often with drawings, okay, we are more likely to be scanning these in and digitizing them to print them onto products. So I think that can be a really nice thing to do as well. So you might actually photograph these or scan these to put onto products as prints, as like sublimation prints if you're printing onto something synthetic, or even to break it down for screen printing, a whole range of different things. Okay. Another thing that I'd thought about, now particularly on these ones where I have used some heavier weight yarns, okay, and obviously I would say that things like this aren't going to come up, but you could use these as a basis for doing things like some simple things like some block printing, or just by putting kind of like rolling ink onto them and then putting them under pressure or into a press to create prints from them. And you could even, depending on what it is you're printing with and onto, you could even work with some of the kind of fine pieces like this as well. So that's the video demonstrating how you might want to work with different objects, so long as you can stick things on the back of them. I think I've done them on stones and rocks, around chairs, all kinds of things, as well as in a much simpler way onto card. Okay, and that is the end of the video. Thank you very much.